In modern NFL history, few names have been as brilliant and controversial as Randy Moss. He stepped into the league and immediately shattered every mold for the wide receiver position. In his rookie season, he scored 17 touchdowns, turned the Minnesota Vikings into a defensive nightmare, and forced the entire league to change the way the game was played. Throughout his career, Moss scored more than 150 touchdowns, led the NFL in scoring touchdowns multiple times, was selected to the Pro Bowl 6 times, earned 4 All-Pro honors, made the All-Decade team for the 2000s, and was ultimately inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in his first year of eligibility. In 2007, wearing the New England Patriots uniform, he set the single-season record with 23 touchdowns, creating one of the most feared offenses in NFL history. Moss's numbers aren't just stats, they're proof of transcendent talent, a player who changed how people understood speed, reach, and fear in defenses. On the field, Randy Moss embodied absolute dominance, a name tied to moments that made entire stadiums hold their breath. But just when the spotlight burned brightest, the rest of his life began to be overshadowed. Because alongside that greatness was a pain that was never recorded in the stat books. For more than 30 years, Moss had to live 2 lives: the hero America celebrated and then doubted, and the real person who always had to shrink himself to survive. He was called arrogant for not bowing his head, labeled lazy for not playing the role the system wanted, seen as a locker room problem just for refusing to pretend to be someone else. While the whole country consumed the image of a rebellious Randy Moss, the man inside had to live with iron discipline, constant vigilance, and a silent will just to not collapse. Every route he ran on the field was a battle against prejudice. Every season was a reminder to survive in a system that never truly believed in him. Achievements brought fame, but not understanding. Glory created distance, but never eased the loneliness. And it was in that tension that Randy Moss's will was forged. Not to be loved, but to survive. Not to be praised, but to not lose himself, even if the price was carrying loneliness for his entire life. If you want to understand the real person behind what America has seen for more than 30 years, hit subscribe and stay with us on this journey as we peel back every layer of truth about Randy Moss. West Virginia isn't a place where people learn to dream. It's where people learn to endure. Small towns scattered across hills and mountains, narrow roads covered in coal dust, old houses standing silent as if they've grown used to being forgotten. There, poverty isn't a phase. It's a condition that stretches across generations. For Randy Moss, childhood didn't start with protection or safety. It started with the constant feeling of needing to stay alert, always bracing for the worst that could happen. His family broke apart early. The adults around him carried exhaustion, anger, and helplessness from a life with no way out. In a home where emotions weren't spoken and love wasn't shown openly, a child learns very quickly that vulnerability is a luxury. Moss wasn't taught to cry when it hurt, because tears didn't put more food on the table or ease the tension in the air. He also wasn't taught to trust, because promises rarely lasted past the next winter. And above all, he wasn't taught that he could need anyone, because in West Virginia, relying on others was sometimes the fastest way to be let down. In that world, Randy Moss grew up like a child who taught himself how to survive. He watched more than he spoke, endured more than he resisted. Anger didn't explode outward, it sank deep inside, becoming an invisible shield. While other kids dreamed of the future, Moss only thought about how to escape the present, not with words, not with faith, but with his body. Sports came to him not as a noble dream or path to glory, but as an instinctual escape. Run faster, jump higher, catch better. Those were the rare moments he felt he controlled something. On the playing field, the rules were clearer than life, the outcomes fairer than what he saw every day in his family and neighborhood. There, effort was rewarded instantly, No explanations needed, no one to convince of his worth. But even as his talent showed early, Moss never saw sports as a dream. He saw it as a way to run away, to get distance from silent dinners, endless arguments, and the ever-present feeling of insecurity. Every stride was a way to stretch the gap between himself and the life that had shaped him too soon. Deep down, Moss wasn't running toward something, he was running from a place that never gave him a sense of belonging. And since no one taught him how to love himself, Moss learned how to be hard. He learned to stand alone, never expecting comfort, never believing the world would go easier on him just because he was young. The emotional insecurity in his family left voids that no achievement could ever fill. Moss grew up with a quiet question. Do I have value if I'm not faster, stronger than everyone else? When unconditional love isn't given, a child easily believes affection must always be earned through performance. And from there, the original tragedy of Randy Moss took shape. He was never taught that he deserved love just for existing. Every bit of worth was tied to what he could do, who he could beat, who he could outrun. This created an iron will, but it also planted the seed for lasting loneliness. In West Virginia, Moss learned how to endure pain without complaint, how to swallow emotions and keep moving forward. Those lessons helped him survive, but they also made him a stranger to himself. When a child isn't taught to love himself, he grows up believing he's only worth something when he's strong, when he needs no one. And Randy Moss carried that belief his whole life, from the dusty roads of West Virginia to the brightly lit stadiums. His childhood didn't allow softness, and that's exactly why gentleness became something he never learned to keep for himself. Randy Moss's talent didn't come from deliberate training or carefully nurtured dreams. It emerged like a natural, almost wild reflex. Even as a very young kid, Moss was faster, taller, stronger than almost everyone around him. On school fields or neighborhood lots, the gap between him and kids his age was so obvious it couldn't be hidden. Just a few strides, a few catches, and every eye turned to him. At first, that attention felt like an escape, a rare feeling of having value. But in a place more accustomed to suspicion than support, talent didn't just bring opportunity, it brought scrutiny, expectations, and crushing pressure that a teenager was never taught how to handle. The more he stood out, the more closely he was watched. Every small action was magnified. Every emotional reaction was interpreted negatively. When another kid lost his temper, it was just a youthful moment. When Moss did the same, it became evidence for a story already written, that he was trouble, that he couldn't control himself. While his talent kept opening doors, that unwanted attention kept placing deeper traps in front of him. Off-field incidents, conflicts with his surroundings, and impulsive teenage decisions slowly built into a record society would never forget. Randy Moss didn't grow up in a world ready to give him second chances. Every mistake of his was remembered longer, repeated more often, and assigned heavier meaning than anyone else's. In that context, talent didn't act as a shield, it acted as a spotlight, shining straight into every dark corner of his life. The better he got, the more he was monitored, the more different he was, the easier he became a target. Conflicts escalated not just because of youthful temperament, but because Moss was never taught how to handle anger or fear safely. Violence, both physical and emotional, crept into his life as something familiar, not because he sought it, but because he didn't know how to escape it. Florida State appeared as a life-changing promise, a destination where Moss's talent could be recognized and turned into a future. For a kid from West Virginia, it wasn't just a prestigious football program. It was a symbol of escape from poverty, from the prejudices that had followed him since childhood. But along with that hope came enormous pressure. At Florida State, Moss entered an environment where every mistake carried a bigger price, where his personal history didn't disappear, it followed him like a shadow. Legal troubles and personal conflicts quickly pushed Moss to the edge. Instead of becoming a redemption story, Florida State became the first brutal proof of a harsh truth. Talent isn't enough to protect anyone from their own inner cracks. The dream of a better life shattered, not because he lacked ability on the field, but because he never had the chance to learn how to live healthily in a world always ready to judge. When the door to Florida State slammed shut, it didn't just close a chapter, it left Moss with a deep psychological scar. From that moment, Randy Moss learned the first and perhaps most painful lesson of his life. Talent is not a guarantee, nor a free pass from consequences. It can bring someone closer to the light, but it also makes the shadow behind them longer and darker. For Moss, talent was both a gift and a curse. It opened the door to the NFL later on, but it also laid the foundation for a life of scrutiny, doubt, and being boxed in. When Florida State ended in collapse, Moss didn't just lose an opportunity, he lost the illusion that being good enough would make the world treat him fairly. And from then on, he stepped into the next part of his life with a cold belief already ingrained. To survive, you can't rely on talent alone, and you can't trust the system to protect you when things turn bad. The 1,998 NFL Draft wasn't a moment of celebration for Randy Moss. It felt more like a silent trial than a ceremony handing out opportunity. In closed rooms where teams sat around tables, highlight tapes were played and quickly turned off, but the thick files stayed open, flipped through slowly and carefully, like reading the record of a defendant. Moss's speed, reach, and catching ability were never denied, but they were placed behind other lines. Troubled past, off-field behavior, locker room risk. When his name came up, the atmosphere wasn't excitement, it was caution. Teams didn't ask, "How good is he?" They asked, "Can we control him?" And in the NFL world, that second question usually carried more weight than all the highlight plays combined. Draft day dragged on with calls that never came, with picks where Moss watched other names get called before his. Each time a team passed, it wasn't just a strategic decision, it was an unspoken judgment on who he was as a person. Moss's past file, even though he'd never been allowed to fully explain it, had become the story that replaced him. What he'd done, what he'd messed up, what he hadn't had time to fix, was magnified into a long-term sentence. In that moment, Moss understood that the NFL didn't just draft players, they drafted profiles they believed were safe. And he, with all his unhealed cracks, didn't fit that mold. When Randy Moss's name was finally called, the feeling wasn't relief, it was a mix of lightness and bitterness. He entered the NFL not as a welcomed talent, but as a conditionally accepted risk. The looks from those around him didn't convey trust. They conveyed vigilance. People watched him like they were waiting for the worst to happen, like one small mistake would confirm every preconception. No one said it outright, but Moss felt it clearly. The trust given to him was always temporary. From that second, Randy Moss stepped into the league with an invisible burden on his shoulders. He didn't just have to prove he belonged on the field. He had to prove he wasn't the person they'd already imagined. But how do you prove something when no one really wants to hear it? Every action of his was scrutinized more closely. Every reaction was interpreted in the worst light. If he stayed quiet, it was attitude. If he spoke up, it was defiance. Moss realized that in this world, he was always put in a losing position before he even started. Draft day wasn't just the door opening to an NFL career. It was the beginning of the double life Moss would have to live for decades afterward. On one side, he had to become the player the team needed, score points, win games, deliver value on the field. On the other, he had to suppress his real self, hide the hurt, the fear, the insecurity, so he wouldn't give more ammunition to those who always doubted. This was a life with no room for error, because every slip could confirm the prejudices already prepared. Moss's loneliness began there not because he had no teammates, but because he was never seen as a whole person. He felt like he always had to play a role, always had to weigh every gesture, every word. While other players were allowed to make mistakes and learn, Moss had to live in fear that one impulsive moment would erase all his effort. Draft day taught him a cold lesson. In the NFL, opportunity doesn't come with trust, and forgiveness isn't always available. When the draft day lights went out, Randy Moss didn't step into the future with the innocence of a rookie. He stepped in with the wary eyes of someone who already understood he'd have to fight on two fronts. One front was the field, where his talent would soon make the entire league take notice. The other was the invisible war against deeply rooted prejudices, where he had to live with the feeling of being convicted before being given a chance. And from that very moment, the double life of Randy Moss officially began, not loud, not declared, but persistent and ruthless, stretching through the rest of his career and his life. Minnesota didn't welcome Randy Moss like a redemption story. They welcomed him like a gamble. From the very first practices, everything carried the color of an experiment rather than belief. Moss walked into the locker room with the familiar eyes of people waiting for the worst, as if one offbeat moment from him would instantly turn every draft day judgment into obvious truth. But when the season started, everything prepared to doubt him was quickly swallowed by an undeniable reality. In his rookie season, Randy Moss exploded in a way the NFL had never seen. He ran deep routes like distance didn't exist, caught balls that seemed impossible, and scored touchdowns with a coldness that silenced entire stadiums. Every Sunday that passed, Moss didn't just score for the Minnesota Vikings, he forced the whole league to change how they defended, to drop deeper, to fear more. His performance far exceeded any expectations for a rookie. 17 touchdown catches in his first season weren't just numbers. They were a declaration that Randy Moss wasn't a project, wasn't an experiment. He was a fully formed genius. Fans cheered, highlights looped endlessly, and the name Moss started being mentioned like a phenomenon. But alongside the on-field brilliance, an invisible wall still surrounded him. Moss was celebrated for what he could do, but never fully trusted for who he was. Even when he scored touchdowns, Moss was still watched. Every celebration gesture, every moment he stood tall without bowing his head, was interpreted as a sign of arrogance. When he didn't run full speed on dead plays, they called it lazy. When he chose silence with the media, they said he lacked respect. The control didn't come from one person or one rule it soaked into the air. Moss had to breathe every day. He'd been labeled beforehand, and every action of his was only used to reinforce that label. In the locker room, Moss felt that invisible line clearly. He had teammates. He had people who respected his talent. But trust was always conditional. He understood he wasn't allowed to make mistakes like others. One small, impulsive act could be blown up into proof of the Randy Moss is a problem story. This forced him to live in constant vigilance, shining on the field while self-regulating every reaction off it. That tension didn't reduce his performance, but it quietly eroded any sense of belonging. Moss began to recognize a bitter paradox. The NFL loved what he brought them, but they didn't truly believe in him. They needed his speed, reach, and scoring ability, but they doubted his motives, his character, his heart. Every contract, every meeting, every article reminded him that the system's love for him was conditional. As long as he kept delivering value, the door stayed open. But trust, understanding, and a feeling of safety always remained out of reach. Moss's explosion in Minnesota didn't bring him complete victory. It brought recognition, but not liberation. He knew that if his performance dipped, the whispers would return even louder. Success didn't erase the past. It only temporarily covered it. And that made Moss close himself off even more. He played with cold focus, as if every catch was an argument, every touchdown a rebuttal, in an invisible courtroom that had judged him from day one. Minnesota became the place where Moss learned to survive in paradox. He was the brightest star, but also the most monitored. He was cheered by tens of thousands, but still felt alone when he walked off the field. His greatness wasn't seen as a gift. It was seen as something to be managed, controlled, and guarded against. And in that process, Randy Moss gradually understood a truth that would follow him through his career. In the NFL, talent can take you to the top, but trust never comes for free. Moss's historic rookie season should have been a fairy tale redemption story, but for him, it was only the first chapter of a life lived under constant surveillance. He no longer naively believed that playing well enough would make everything okay. Minnesota taught him that even when you're the best on the field, the system can still keep you at a safe distance. And from then on, Randy Moss moved forward in his career with a cold realization. The NFL needed him, but never fully trusted him. That quiet but persistent doubt became the heaviest burden he carried, walking alongside every great play he made. The media didn't create Randy Moss's talent, but they did create the image of the person America believed he was. And once that image was repeated long enough, it became truth in the public eye. Disjointed moments on the field were cut from context, separated from the full story, then placed side by side like pieces of a distorted picture. A play where Moss didn't run full speed when the game was already decided, an eye that didn't look down when a coach yelled, a cold celebration after a touchdown. Each individual moment, standing alone, said nothing special. But when placed together, replayed on television, in newspapers, and on debate shows, they began to tell a completely different story. A story of laziness, of an oversized ego, of a player who didn't respect the team. That story was told and retold until no one questioned its accuracy anymore. Each passing season, any action by Moss was pulled into the same template. If he exploded, they said it was because his talent was so big he didn't need to try. If he slumped, they took it as proof of lacking motivation. In the simple logic of mass media, every outcome led back to the same predetermined conclusion. Randy Moss was no longer a complex human being with context, history, and his own cracks. He became a character, a familiar role for the audience to easily hate. The most painful thing wasn't the direct criticism, it was the endless repetition of it. When something is said enough times, it no longer needs proof. Lazy, arrogant, not trying, became labels stuck so tightly to Moss's name that even his extraordinary achievements weren't enough to peel them off. People no longer saw his explosive runs, his contested catches in the air, or the historic numbers he put up as the result of discipline and will. They saw them as proof that he could do even better if he just tried harder. And in that mindset, every effort Moss made was dismissed before it could even be acknowledged. The media didn't care about what happened in the weight room, the long injury treatments, or the nights Moss came home with an aching body and a heavy mind. They didn't tell stories about him showing up early, leaving late, or staying quiet to avoid hurting others. Those details didn't fit the narrative they'd already chosen. What they needed was a clear, simple, sellable image. And Randy Moss, with his complicated past and his refusal to bow his head, became the perfect choice for the villain role. At first, Moss tried to push back against that tide, but every explanation only made the story bigger. Every time he spoke up, it was interpreted as defensiveness, as defiance, as proof that he really was the person they said he was. Gradually, Moss realized something brutal. In this game, his words carried no weight, not because he was wrong, but because no one really wanted to hear them. So he chose silence. Not because he agreed with what was said about him, but because speaking up only made the wounds deeper. That silence didn't bring peace, but it brought a kind of control. Moss stopped feeding material to stories he couldn't control. He let the media keep building their version of him while he stepped back, sealing off his inner world. From there, his double life became clearer than ever. One life for the audience, where he existed as a hated symbol, a figure judged through screens, and another life that belonged only to him, where he maintained discipline, focus, and pains that were never broadcast. Moss learned to live with that separation as a survival mechanism. On the field, he did the one thing no one could take away: play at the highest level. Off the field, he withdrew, staying away from the lights, away from conversations with predetermined outcomes. He no longer sought understanding from the public, because he knew his image had been locked in. The only thing he could protect was the real person inside, even if the price was growing loneliness. When America learned to hate Randy Moss, they didn't realize they were hating a version built from incomplete pieces. And Moss, in his silence, accepted living with that paradox. He gave the audience what they wanted to see and kept the rest for himself. That wasn't surrender. It was a painful choice. The choice to survive in a world that had decided his story long before he ever had a chance to speak. Oakland wasn't a place for healing, and Randy Moss didn't arrive there hoping for redemption. The Raiders took him in as an expensive piece in a fractured system where chaos wasn't a temporary glitch. It was the permanent state. A loud locker room, constantly shifting decisions, unresolved conflicts just pushed to another day. There was no strong enough voice to shield Moss from the prejudices that had followed him from Minnesota, and no one really wanted to listen when he stayed quiet. Moss's silence was misinterpreted as indifference. His withdrawal was read as a lack of commitment. In an environment that already doubted him from the start, everything he did was forced into the same old template. If he played well, it was raw talent. If he struggled, it was proof of no motivation. In Oakland, Randy Moss didn't fight back. He didn't argue, didn't make noise, didn't try to explain. He just quietly walked onto the field, did his job, and stepped back into the shadows behind the locker room door. But that silence, when it stopped being a strategy, began to signal something else. Moss wasn't turning off his voice to conserve energy. He was fading because the belief had run out. The belief that effort would be recognized. The belief that if he did things right, things would change. The belief that the real him, quiet and guarded, still had a place in a system that always demanded performance. Every practice passed like an emotionless ritual. His body still followed orders, his mind still understood the assignments, but his heart wasn't there anymore. Moss ran the routes he needed to run, caught the balls in reach, scored when chances came, but the inner drive was gone. No more joy, no more anger fueling breakthroughs, just an emptiness covered by professional habit. This wasn't laziness. This was functional depression, a state outsiders could barely notice because everything still functioned. He still showed up. He still played. But inside, a crucial part had left the game. In that environment, Moss understood no one was on his side. No umbrella to shield him from the media. No explanations offered when the old stories got retold. If something went wrong, it was Moss's fault. If something went right, it was thanks to the system. That division of responsibility didn't need to be spoken. It soaked into the way people looked at him, the way they talked about him when he wasn't around. And when a person is placed in a position where they have to defend themselves all the time, but have no tools to do it, the natural reflex is to retreat. Moss retreated not to challenge, but to survive. Oakland completed the split in Moss's life, an outer life, where he was the judged symbol, the blamed figure, the cautionary tale, and an inner life where he shrank, conserved emotional energy, kept himself from fully collapsing. He no longer tried to prove anything to people who'd already decided the story. He no longer sought recognition from a system that didn't believe in him. The outward indifference became a shell for a deep exhaustion built up over every season, every meeting, every article. Functional depression isn't loud. It doesn't make someone collapse mid-game. It makes them do just enough not to get cut, but not enough to feel alive. That's what Randy Moss was in Oakland. He fulfilled the role, but he wasn't connected anymore. He appeared, but he wasn't present, and that made those around him believe even more in the story they wanted. That Moss didn't care. They didn't see, or didn't want to see, that the not caring was the result of constant erosion, of having no one step up and say he wasn't the problem. The days in the Raiders passed in a directionless haze. No anchor to push back against, no fuel to explode. Moss learned to ration what little energy remained, saving it for what really mattered: family, privacy, and the peace of self he refused to let the system crush. If Minnesota was where he learned talent couldn't buy trust, then Oakland was where he learned that once trust is gone, it takes motivation with it. When people look back at that period and call it a disappointment, they miss the core. This wasn't the story of a player past his prime. This was the story of a human placed in an environment with no room for understanding, where silence was misunderstood, and where just existing was already an effort. Randy Moss didn't give up because he was weak. He faded because he understood that fighting in a space that wouldn't listen only caused more damage. Oakland didn't kill Moss's career with a direct blow. It did something crueler. It made him stop caring. And when a person stops caring not from lack of talent, but from depleted belief, that's when the wound becomes deepest quiet, prolonged, and the hardest to heal in the entire double life he was forced to live. New England came to Randy Moss like a door that opened late, not to erase what had happened, but to put him back in his rightful place on the field. When he stepped into the Patriots, Moss didn't bring hope of being loved or understood. He brought a cold awareness forged in Oakland. If there was anything left to believe in, it was the work. Here, everything ran on structure, discipline, and efficiency. No one asked who he was, and no one expected him to become something else. They just needed him to do his job. And Randy Moss, in the prolonged emotional emptiness, answered with the only weapon that had never betrayed him: pure talent. What happened next quickly went beyond all expectations. Moss exploded, as if all the years of suppression had finally found an outlet. Deep roots tore apart defenses, catches in tight windows, touchdowns piling up until they became the new normal. The record of 23 touchdowns in a single season wasn't just set. It was established with the cold precision of a perfectly running machine. NFL history was rewritten, and Moss's name stood once again at the center of greatness. Stadiums roared, scoreboards lit up. Experts called it the most spectacular resurgence of a once-doubted talent. But none of what happened on the outside touched what was inside him. The biggest difference between New England and the places before wasn't the production. It was the emotional distance. In the Patriots, Moss didn't have to prove who he was off the field. He wasn't watched for every gesture, wasn't required to explain his feelings. That gave him professional freedom, but it didn't give him a sense of belonging. Moss fit into the system like a perfect gear, but he never truly became part of the machine in a human sense. He showed up, worked, scored, and left. No deep attachment. No feeling that this was home. Moss played in New England like someone who'd learned to detach himself from emotion. Every route was an order executed, every catch a task completed. He no longer looked for joy in wins, nor let losses reach him. The outward indifference, once criticized in Oakland, now became an advantage. It allowed absolute focus, undisturbed by anything unrelated to the field. But the price of that focus was prolonged emptiness. When you play like a machine, you reach peak performance, but you lose the feeling of being alive. In the locker room, Moss still kept his distance. He didn't cause trouble, didn't create drama, but he also didn't open up. The years of being misunderstood had taught him that emotional attachment was a risk. In New England, he chose safety. He let his greatness speak for itself and kept the rest to himself. Teammates respected him. The system used him, but no one truly reached the person inside who'd been worn down for years. Moss didn't need that anymore. Or at least he convinced himself he didn't. The resurgence with the Patriots, therefore, carried a different shade. It wasn't a story of rediscovering joy, it was a story of precision. Everything was in the right place, at the right time, fulfilling the right function. Moss did what he was born to do, and he did it at the highest level of perfection. But every time he left the field, when the cheers faded, the familiar emptiness returned. There was no complete sense of victory, no inner release. Success came fast and brilliant, but it healed none of the wounds that had built up from West Virginia, from Florida State, from Minnesota, and Oakland. New England gave Randy Moss what he'd always been denied, the chance to prove that his talent had never been the problem. But it didn't give him what he'd lost long ago, the feeling of belonging. He stood in the middle of a winning team, yet still felt like an outsider. His greatness was acknowledged, but the man himself remained on the margins of the story. And perhaps, because of that, Moss chose to keep separating himself, to keep operating like a machine where emotion was no longer necessary fuel. During those years, Randy Moss reached a peak that very few ever touch, but he did it with a heart that had learned not to expect anything. He didn't seek connection because he knew how painful losing it could be. The Patriots were where his career was revived, but they were also where the price of the double life he'd lived showed most clearly. He had everything a player dreams of: records, history, greatness, but when all the lights went out, what remained was a man who'd done his job spectacularly to the point of perfection, while the feeling of belonging stayed out of reach. Randy Moss's body didn't collapse in one moment. It was eroded day by day, practice by practice, hit by hit, that the cameras never caught. While the New England highlights kept playing as proof of a spectacular comeback, another story ran parallel, quiet, and with no place in the evening sports broadcast. It was the story of hamstrings tearing over and over, of chronic lower back pain that became the new normal, of knees so numb that some mornings Moss had to wait a few minutes to feel his legs again before getting out of bed. On the field, he still ran, still jumped, still caught balls as if his body wasn't resisting at all. But when the locker room door closed, what was left was a man carrying the violence of the NFL home every night, silently and unseen. With the Patriots, Moss played like a machine, and his body paid the price for that precision. Not many questions were asked when he showed up and completed the task. Few asked how many painkiller shots he'd taken, how many ice sessions he'd done, or how poorly he'd slept because of the constant dull ache. The NFL didn't film the long treatment sessions, the minutes lying still on the training table under cold white lights shining straight down. Those images didn't fit the comeback and greatness story people wanted to tell, and Moss, accustomed to silence, didn't speak up either. He understood that his pain didn't provide entertainment value. Moss's hamstrings didn't just strain once and heal. They became a recurring weak point, a constant reminder that the speed which had taken him to the top was also what would take the most away. Every acceleration, every cut, carried the risk of tearing a little more. His back, absorbing awkward landings and high-speed collisions, began to hurt in ways that couldn't be clearly pinpointed. It wasn't a sharp pain that came and went. It was a heavy, lingering sensation that seeped into every small movement. His knees, after years of twisting force and hard landings, gradually lost their former feel. In some games, Moss no longer clearly sensed the turf under his feet, but he still took the field, because that was what was expected. Playing through pain became habit, not a special event. Moss learned to separate his body from his mind, treating pain signals like noise to be ignored. This wasn't romantic courage, it was a survival mechanism. When you've lived in silence for too long, you learn to endure without an audience. And Randy Moss, used to keeping his emotions to himself, kept his physical pain there too. He didn't show it off, didn't complain, didn't ask for special treatment. He just worked. The bitter part was that when his body started to speak up, it was often misinterpreted. If Moss slowed a step, people said he lacked motivation. If he didn't explode like before, they said he was past his prime. Few connected that decline to years of accumulated injuries, to the cost of running faster than everyone else in a league that doesn't forgive. The NFL prefers to tell stories of decline as mental or attitudinal problems because they're simpler and more consumable than the complex truth of a human body being worn down. Moss's body gradually became a diary of NFL violence, recording every collision, every off-balance landing, every time he was shoved out of bounds with enough force to rattle his frame. None of the pages in that diary were written in beautiful ink. They were all etched in pain, in nameless endurance. And like many athletes, Moss understood that reading that diary aloud wouldn't bring anything better. It would only make people question his ability, or worse, question his will. After every game, when the cheers had died down, Moss went home with a body that needed time to recover and a mind accustomed to not expecting sympathy. He carried the pain into sleep, woke up with it the next morning, and repeated the cycle. No one filmed those moments because they didn't fit the image of a legend in resurgence, but those were the truest parts of his life. That quiet erosion of the body mirrored the double life Moss had lived. On the outside, he was a symbol of greatness, of historic numbers and immortal moments. On the inside, he was a man trying to hold on to his own integrity against a system that consumed bodies faster than anyone was willing to admit. The violence of the NFL wasn't just in the hits the audience saw. It was in the way it taught people like Moss to accept pain as a given. When looking back on this period, it's easy to talk about records, history, and resurgence. Much harder is talking about the price the body paid to sustain that story. Randy Moss didn't just bring his talent to the field every Sunday. He brought unhealed wounds, nameless pains, and a silence that had become instinct. And in that silence, his body told the truest story about the NFL. A story where greatness and violence walk side by side, and where the greatest often learn to endure the most without anyone knowing. Family didn't enter Randy Moss's life like a miraculous cure. It arrived like a thin thread, holding him in place when everything else was slipping away. After years of a body worn down and a mind that had learned to detach from emotion, Moss stepped into fatherhood with a deep, never-leaving fear. The fear that his children would inherit not just talent, but fate. He'd lived long enough to understand that the name Moss didn't just carry expectations. It dragged along prejudice, scrutiny, and invisible pressure that no child should have to bear. So his love for his kids wasn't loud or showy. It showed up in overprotection, in keeping distance from the spotlight, in quiet decisions to make sure the harsh world that had once swallowed him wouldn't easily reach them. Moss fathered the way someone does who's learned too early that love always comes with risk. He didn't want his children to grow up in the shadow of fame, didn't want every step they took compared and measured by standards he knew too well. He feared that if they carried the Moss name into the world, it would arrive before their real selves, just as it had once arrived before him. That fear didn't make him distant. It made him cautious to an extreme. He chose privacy, chose quiet evenings, chose a life where family was at the center, but never under the lights. For Moss, family wasn't a place to unload every wound, because some wounds he didn't know how to share. He didn't use love as a way to heal the past, but as a reason to keep existing. Everyday moments, simple meals, small laughs, undemanding presence became fragile but necessary anchors. They didn't erase what happened in West Virginia, Florida State, Minnesota, Oakland, or New England. They just created a small enough safe space so he wouldn't fall completely into the void. There were times Moss wondered if he was doing the right thing by keeping his family at a distance from the world he knew too well. But every time he looked into his children's eyes, he remembered what he hadn't had: protection from pre-written stories, from being defined before they could speak their first word. He didn't want them to learn not to cry, not to trust, not to need anyone the way he had. And the paradox here is that because he never fully learned to love himself completely, Moss poured all his remaining energy into shielding the people he loved from that same fate. Family didn't save Randy Moss, because no one can save someone who's lived too long in survival mode. But family kept him from disappearing. When physical pain made him want to withdraw from the world, when mental exhaustion made him want to shut off every connection, family became the reason to stay. Not out of loud obligation or declared responsibility, but out of a simple wish, not to let the people he loved live in the emptiness he'd known too well. In family life, Moss didn't have to play a role. He wasn't a symbol, wasn't a controversial story, wasn't a name stuck with old labels. He was just a man trying to show up in the best way he knew how. That presence wasn't perfect, wasn't always gentle, but it was real. And that quiet authenticity created an anchor, fragile, but enough for him to hold on to when everything else had become unfamiliar. Love in Moss's life, therefore, carried a different shade. It wasn't flashy, didn't promise healing, didn't offer any guarantees. It just said he wasn't completely alone, that there were people who needed him to stay, even though he was never someone who easily opened up. Family gave him a role not based on achievements or public expectations, and that, however small, had its own weight. In the end, Randy Moss didn't find redemption in family. He found a reason to keep going. And for someone who'd lived too long amid violence, prejudice, and silence, that was perhaps the most realistic form of hope. Family didn't erase the double life he'd had to live, but they kept him from falling out of this world. In that fragility, Moss stood firm not as a legend, but as a human who'd chosen to stay, even though the cost of existing was always present in every breath. The death of Randy Moss's father didn't come as a loud event. It came late and quiet, like a door closing while someone was still trying to step through. When the news arrived, Moss had already gone through most of the most important chapters of his life. Fame, controversy, greatness, exhaustion, but some conversations can't be rescheduled, and they can't be made up for. His father left carrying everything that hadn't been said, questions that were never asked at the right time, and apologies that were never spoken. For Moss, that wasn't just the loss of a loved one, it was the end of a possibility, the possibility of repair. The father-son relationship in Moss's life always existed in a state of incompleteness, not because of a lack of love, but because of a lack of shared language to express it. The harsh years of childhood had taught him how to endure, not how to reveal. As an adult, Moss carried that distance like a habit. He believed there would be time, that the hard things could wait, that work, responsibility, and daily survival were enough to prove attachment. But death doesn't wait for anyone's schedule. It came and froze every remaining opportunity. After the funeral, Moss withdrew in a way only those very close to him noticed. There were no grand statements, no emotional outbursts, no speeches filled with memories. He chose silence. A different kind of silence from the years before. If silence had once been a survival strategy, now it became a space for enduring. Some pains don't need an audience, don't need to be named, because naming them doesn't change anything. This pain was absolute because it closed every path back. Moss began to look back at his life through a harsher lens. The seasons, the records, the public debates suddenly became small in the face of a simple truth. Some things that mattered had been put off for too long. He understood that he'd lived most of his life in defense mode, always bracing for the next hit, to the point of forgetting that some relationships need nurturing while they still can be. That realization didn't lead to collapse, but it created a deep cut, a cut of irreversible regret. In the days that followed, Moss turned to his family with even quieter presence. He stayed closer, listened more, spoke less, not to make amends, but to not repeat the pattern. His father's death became a stern reminder that time isn't an infinite resource, and emotional distances, if not filled, become permanent voids. He didn't turn the pain into a moral lesson, didn't preach it as a public message. He let it exist inside him, changing his rhythm of life, changing how he showed up for those who remained. This pain didn't make Moss louder. It made him quieter, not depressed, but a kind of heavy stillness. He accepted that some things can't be fixed, only carried, and carrying them is part of continuing to live. His father's death didn't destroy Moss, but it took away the illusion that everything can circle back to be done right. From then on, every choice became more careful, every presence more deliberate. At an age that had seen enough ups and downs, Moss didn't seek comfort from the public. He didn't need anyone to understand his pain for it to be real. The truth of the pain lay in the fact that it didn't need validation. It existed in private moments, in quiet evenings, in the way he looked at his children and thought about the things he wanted to say before it was too late. His father's death was a late cut, but not a shallow one. It didn't make Moss collapse on the spot, but it changed the way he carried himself as he kept walking. No more chance to say the unsaid. That's irreversible. And because it's irreversible, the pain became absolute. Moss carried it as part of himself, not displaying it, not avoiding it. In that quietness, he learned to keep living without promising healing, only promising presence long enough, real enough, so he wouldn't have to face the same cut again. When Randy Moss stepped up to the Hall of Fame podium, it wasn't a moment of victory the way people usually expect. There was no grand eloquence, no fierce declaration that he had been right while the world was wrong. Instead, the atmosphere carried an unusually quiet feeling, as if Moss himself understood that this wasn't the place to keep performing the role that had followed him his entire career. For the first time in many years, he didn't need to prove anything anymore. And because he didn't need to prove, he allowed himself to pause. Moss's speech was short, restrained, and completely lacking the elements the public usually expects from a legend. He didn't list achievements, didn't recount historic moments, didn't answer the criticisms that had trailed him like a shadow. Instead, he talked about his mother, slowly, without embellishment, without drama. In that moment, people realized this was the only emotional axis Moss allowed to show in public. The woman who had been there from the beginning, when West Virginia was still a harsh world, when talent hadn't yet become a shield, when no one else had the patience to stand beside a child forced to grow up too fast. Moss's choice to mention his mother wasn't random. It was his way of talking about endurance without needing to explain. He didn't tell sob stories, didn't detail the hard years. He just named his origin, as if saying that if anything deserved recognition, it wasn't the records, it was that he'd survived long enough to stand here. Not once in the speech did Moss try to defend the misunderstandings, the labels, or the stories told about him for 3 decades. The absence of defense carried more weight than any rebuttal could. That was a rare moment when Moss wasn't performing anymore. No more defending, no more distance, no more strategic silence to control his image. He stood there as a man who'd walked a long journey and understood that not everything needs to be fixed to be right. Some cracks don't need to be hidden, they just need to be acknowledged. And Moss did that in the most minimal way. No apologies, no blame, just admitting he'd endured enough. For a moment, the audience saw what they'd rarely seen throughout Moss's career: unhidden exhaustion. Not exhaustion from age, but from living too long in a state of self-protection. When you've had to play a role for too long, stopping becomes an act of courage. Moss didn't cry, didn't break his voice, but that restraint said more than any outburst could. It showed a person who'd learned to keep everything inside and only allowed a small enough crack for light to slip through. The Hall of Fame, for many, is where the story closes with glory. For Moss, it was where he set down the final mask, not to be understood, but to no longer have to be misunderstood. He didn't demand belated recognition for his real self. He simply confirmed its existence before stepping down from the podium and returning to the private world he'd guarded for so long. That moment didn't heal the wounds accumulated from West Virginia to Oakland, from the Minnesota lights to the emptiness in New England. But it marked a clear boundary. From here, Moss no longer needed to prove he belonged. He'd gone through every form of judgment to understand that the final recognition doesn't come from the crowd. It comes from stopping, looking straight at what you've carried, and saying something simple, without flair: "I've endured enough." When Moss left the stage that day, he didn't leave behind a manifesto. He left behind a silence. And in that silence, for the first time, people could clearly see the crack that had always been there, not as a weakness, but as the mark of a human who'd survived too much to keep performing. After the NFL, Randy Moss didn't enter a phase of redefining his image like many legends do. He didn't appear constantly on television, didn't join image repair campaigns, didn't write a memoir to explain every moment taken out of context. His absence wasn't accidental, it was a deliberate choice. After decades living under lights and being defined by others, Moss understood that any explanation would only pull him back into the same loop, speaking only to be reinterpreted differently. So he chose silence not as avoidance, but as a belated right to self-determination. Moss appeared sparingly, only when and if he felt it was necessary, not to clarify anything, but to show up on his own terms. He didn't fix his image, because he had long grown accustomed to the fact that the image didn't belong to him. For so many years, people had built a Randy Moss the way they wanted to believe, and he paid the price for that, whether he spoke up or not. After the Hall of Fame, he understood that continuing to explain would only bring the past back to life in ways he couldn't control. Silence, this time, was no longer a survival mechanism. It was a free choice. Not seeking recognition is the hardest thing in a culture where presence equals value. But Moss had lived too long in a system that measured worth by noise to still believe it brought peace. He didn't need belated praise to validate what he'd endured. He didn't need collective understanding to know his story mattered. Meaning, for Moss, lay in no longer having to explain why he stayed silent, why he kept distance, why he didn't play by the rules of attention. That intentional withdrawal allowed Moss to live at a different rhythm. No packed schedule, no cycle of debates, no pressure to respond to every comment. He spent time with family, with a body that carried too many memories of violence, with mornings where he didn't have to prove anything. In that quietness, Moss didn't try to rewrite history. He let it stand intact, with all its complexity and contradictions. Accepting being misunderstood was the final step in letting go. Moss understood there would always be people who only remembered the old labels, the controversial moments, the stories told too many times. He no longer felt the need to correct them, because correcting takes energy, and that energy he chose to keep for what truly belonged to him. When you've lived under scrutiny for too long, not being seen anymore becomes a kind of mercy. After the NFL, Randy Moss didn't disappear to be forgotten. He disappeared to live. His silence wasn't a confession, nor was it defiance. It was a clear boundary drawn. Some parts of a person are no longer for the public. And in accepting that, Moss reached a realistic form of peace. Not perfect, not fully healed, but enough to keep going without needing to explain. That choice didn't make his story neater. It made it truer. Because life after the lights doesn't need climaxes or conclusions. It just needs consistency between what people think and what a person chooses to do. Randy Moss chose silence. And in that silence, he finally no longer had to live two parallel lives. 30 years living as a role didn't leave loud scars. It left slow, persistent, hard-to-see erosion unless you stopped long enough to look. When looking back at Randy Moss's entire journey, what stands out isn't the great moments or the controversies that once shook public opinion. What stands out is how one person had to constantly adjust himself to survive in a system that decided his story very early. Prejudice didn't come as a single blow. It came like steady rain, soaking into every choice, every reflex, every silence. And over time, it shaped how Moss stood, how he spoke, and ultimately, how he chose not to speak. The damage accumulated along paths few noticed. Not always physical injuries, though his body carried plenty of NFL violence's marks, but the damage of being repeatedly misunderstood. When you're labeled long enough, you start living to avoid confirming that label. Moss learned to control emotion not because he lacked it, but because his emotions were always interpreted in the worst light. Restraint became armor. The armor thickened with every season, every article, every retold story stripped of context. That erosion didn't make Moss collapse in front of the public. It made him shrink the circle of trust, shrink the circle of closeness, and shrink expectations of understanding. That was the cost of wearing a mask too long. You no longer know for sure which face is real when you look in the mirror. Not because you lost it, but because you protected it too well. Moss didn't fight the system with words or declarations. He fought by existing quietly, by continuing to do his job well while keeping his core from bending. Saying Moss beat the system isn't accurate. The system kept running its way, kept telling simplified stories, kept needing easily consumable roles. But saying the system destroyed him is another misunderstanding. What Moss achieved, and this is the hardest part, was not letting it destroy his character. He didn't become what people said about him. He didn't use bitterness to justify numbness, didn't use hurt to justify hurting others. In a world where the natural reflex to prejudice is to fight back or give up, Moss chose a third path, holding on to his moral center and withdrawing from the endless argument. 30 years. Wearing a mask tires a person in a way that's hard to name. Not tired from overwork, but tired from always calculating. Every action can be clipped out of context. Every word can become a headline. That fatigue doesn't vanish when the career ends. It follows you home, follows you into quiet evenings, follows you in the choice to stay silent instead of explain. Moss carried that fatigue, not as a complained burden, but as an accepted reality. What's worth noting is that, despite the erosion, Moss didn't let himself be fully defined by the damage. He kept family as an anchor, personal discipline as a boundary line, and distance from the lights as a belated freedom. Those choices didn't heal every crack, but they kept the cracks from spreading. Character, in this story, isn't moral perfection. It's the ability not to betray yourself when forced to perform for too long. 30 years living as a role taught Moss a bitter but clear lesson. You can't control how others tell your story, but you can control whether you believe that story or not. He chose not to believe. He chose to live by standards that didn't need public validation. And in that choice, there was a quiet victory, not victory over the system, but victory over the temptation to become the distorted version the system expected. As this chapter closes, what remains isn't a grand conclusion. What remains is an uncomfortable but necessary truth. The cost of wearing a mask too long is that you'll have to learn to take it off in silence. Randy Moss did that slowly, without show, and without an audience. And right there, where there was no longer a stage, no longer a role, his character stood firm, as the only thing not eroded through 3 decades full of prejudice and hurt. Randy Moss didn't reach the end of this journey with a sense of triumph. There was no moment that closed every wound, no miracle that suddenly made the past easier to bear, no full understanding from a world used to seeing him through distorted pieces. If anything existed at the end, it was endurance stretched so long it could no longer be called hope. Moss didn't beat the system that shaped him, didn't beat the prejudices that followed him for 3 decades, and didn't beat the cracks life left behind. He simply kept existing, day by day, in a state where victory was no longer the measure. Not healing is the hardest truth to accept. What happened in West Virginia didn't disappear when he set records. The years of being called a problem weren't erased when he stood in the Hall of Fame. The physical pains didn't turn into medals, and the emotional silences didn't automatically gain meaning just because people called him a legend. Moss carried all of it, not as trophies, but as unavoidable baggage. Some wounds don't need fixing because there's no way to fix them. They just need to be carried without letting them dictate every remaining choice. Not being fully understood is the final price of living two lives for too long. The public understood the plays, the numbers, the explosive moments. They didn't understand, and perhaps couldn't understand, the feeling of having to shrink yourself to survive, of wearing a mask to avoid being crushed, of staying silent to preserve the core. Moss accepted that gap as a non-negotiable reality. He no longer needed to be explained correctly, because correct explanation brought nothing beyond reopening closed doors. At this endpoint, Randy Moss doesn't stand as a celebrated hero, nor as a failure to pity. He stands as a man who's gone through enough to understand that survival sometimes has no soundtrack. Survival is waking up every day with memories that won't leave, keeping character from bending under bitterness, choosing silence over causing more hurt to others and to himself. If you look closely, the scariest thing isn't what Moss lost, but what he had to give up to stay whole. He gave up the need to be liked, gave up hope for mass understanding, gave up the right to react instinctively. Those surrenders didn't create victory. They created a narrow enough path to keep going without disappearing. And sometimes, keeping going is all a person can do. Randy Moss didn't survive to become a legend. Legend is how others tell the story after everything settles. He survived because the cost of disappearing was higher. Disappearing isn't leaving the field or the lights. Disappearing is letting prejudice fully define who you are, letting bitterness replace character, letting silence become nothingness. Moss chose not to disappear that way. He stayed not to be applauded, but to not lose himself. The absolute tragic end of this story isn't that Moss wasn't loved the way he deserved, or understood the way he needed. It's that he had to learn to accept those things might never come, and still keep living, still show up for family, still hold boundaries for himself, still walk forward, even without a clear destination. He didn't win. He endured. And in that endurance, there was no spotlight, no promises, just a raw truth. Sometimes, dignity isn't measured by victory, but by the ability not to let the cruelest things take away the very last thing left a person's character. Randy Moss reached the end of his journey like that, not healed, not fully understood, but still standing there. And sometimes, standing there is the final form of courage that life allows. The story of Randy Moss isn't an epic of triumph. It's a very American tragedy about the cost of talent when it falls into a system that never learned to listen to the human being behind the stats. The most heartbreaking part isn't the physical injuries, torn hamstrings, chronic back pain, numb knees, but the invisible damage accumulated over 30 years. Being led by prejudice, being clipped out of context by the media, being required to perform character to fit a pre-existing mold. In this story, Moss never dodged responsibility. He stayed silent because he understood his words had lost the right to be believed. That silence wasn't indifference, it was a survival mechanism in front of a machine that loved talent but didn't trust the person. Even more painful was the paradox of success. Minnesota exploded but was under constant surveillance. Oakland's chaos killed belief entirely. New England set records but left him hollow inside. Moss played like a machine because that was the only way to survive without being crushed. Family didn't save him. It only kept him here. A small but haunting detail that shows love sometimes doesn't heal. It just stops a person from disappearing. The Hall of Fame speech, when he only mentioned his mother and said he'd endured enough, was a rare crack where Moss stopped performing and acknowledged the price of living two lives. The lesson for America is right here. Don't confuse performance with character. Don't turn prejudice into headlines. And don't demand that people be perfect to deserve trust. A strong society isn't one that produces the most stars. It's one that knows how to protect people from being eroded by their own spotlight. Randy Moss didn't win. He endured. And that endurance reminds us that dignity doesn't come from victory. It comes from not letting the system take away the last thing left: character. If you value real stories about the human beings behind the spotlight, hit subscribe to join us on the journey of retelling the fates that endured far more than they ever won. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, and see you in the next video where the quiet truths continue to find their voice.